Okay, and
the shared revenue proposals that are making their way through the legislature with great potential for mischief. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Phil.
Great. Can everybody hear me okay and see the slides? Is that Peter? Everything looks okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, looks good.
Good. Well, thank you, Peter, for that introduction. And I do want to talk about something that I think is quite urgent. We're likely to see action on a pretty important piece of legislation that could be the final action that the legislature takes on it tomorrow afternoon, beginning at noon. And so there's a certain matter of urgency here. But it's also, I think, the topic of revenue sharing is something that when I talk to outsiders, people not in Wisconsin and following this, their eyes tend to glaze over. And I think it's kind of mired in obscurity. And so I want to just give a little bit of an introduction to why it matters and what the issues are, what the stakes are, and what's going on right now, including what might happen tomorrow. So I always like to begin by talking about this in very concrete terms. Think of a government service that you use or rely on every day, right? It could be, what happens when you get up and walk on the street, when you are driving home and you're expecting there to be street lights on, the library, fire service. Chances are that service is funded by your county or your municipal government. Just give you a quick example here. This is the allocation of Milwaukee's city budget. A huge chunk of that is devoted to public works. That's things like streets, street lights, a lot of the kind of built environment of our world, fire, libraries, a lot of essential services. Milwaukee County, a little bit of a different portfolio of things, but things that really matter, right? I just took the bus to and from work today. That is a county-funded service. Health and Human Services are a big part of what the county does as well in taking care of our neighbors, right? So these are really, really important services, things that we use every day. But here's the second thing I want to say in setting up this issue, which is that local governments, just because they spend money on critical services, they are not masters of their own financial destiny. We might want them to be, but they're not. The state of Wisconsin is. And to just give you a quick rundown of how Wisconsin is the master of local government's financial destinies, it preempts cities and counties from using certain kinds of revenue sources to pay for things. So it says they can't really use sales and income tax to a great extent. It sets limits on the kinds of taxes that they can collect, so property tax levy limits. It determines what kind of property can be taxed at all. And it imposes not just restrictions on raising revenue, but what local governments spend money on. About 70% of Milwaukee's county budget is tied up in unfunded mandates, things that the state requires the county to do. And then finally, Wisconsin also provides shared revenue, which is the second largest revenue source for local governments around the state. So even thinking about local governments, what the state does really matters. I'll give you an example of that. Because the state prevents cities from collecting sales taxes, what that means is that we're relying really heavily on property taxes, and that in other cities, it's just a comparison. The solid line here is non-property taxes in 150 big cities across the United States over time. And you can see that that line is getting higher. Milwaukee and Madison, which are in that data set, have really remained flat. So collecting revenue for important city services that's not from property taxes has been really restrained. Now, the trade-off that Wisconsin has made for over the last 100 years is it said, look, when Wisconsin created a progressive income tax, and when it exempted certain forms of property from taxation, the trade-off was this: we're going to take away local government's power from taxing certain kinds of things. But in exchange, we're going to share back that revenue with local government. So shared revenue, what we're talking about, what's being debated over the last few months, it's not a gift or noblesse oblige. It is a return of revenue to local governments that the state preempts from them. So hopefully that makes sense. So there have been different formulas for using that over time. But the most important development over the last 30 years is that we have not updated that formula to meet current reality. So the amount of money that local governments around the state get has basically been frozen in place since 2003. And in real dollar terms, if you freeze something in place and you have inflation, that means that the real value of that money decreases over time. So this is just county and municipal aid, again, for all of those important services that I mentioned before, has fallen pretty precipitously since 2000 in real constant dollar terms. So that is a picture of neglect by the state government. Now, what that means in practical terms is that as counties' revenues to the state have increased, so this is Milwaukee County's major taxpayer revenues that have gone to the state have increased pretty precipitously. It's a nice, big, healthy, positive trend over time. The amount of money that counties like Milwaukee get back from the state, and this is in nominal terms, so not adjusting for inflation, has just remained stagnant, okay? So what that means is, in no uncertain terms, crisis conditions, right? This might just look sort of like lines on a graph or numbers in a spreadsheet, but flagging shared revenue creates crisis conditions. And I don't want to get into the weeds too much here, but let me just pull out two examples. The city and county of Milwaukee have in recent months asked their departments to evaluate what the effects of no changes in state policy would be. And the results are a need for severe cuts at the local level. City of Milwaukee has explored across the board cuts of 10% to 25%. So in the most extreme scenario, the library, which is a service I use all the time, lots of my neighbors use, it's not just where books are, it is an important vital hub for our neighbors in our communities. A 10 to 25% cut in the most extreme scenario, the library would cut 10 branches. That's 10 really important hubs around the city for social life, just eliminated. I'll give you another example. If any of you take the bus, Milwaukee County Transit Services has explored the possibility of eliminating 16 of 36 of its 36 bus routes. Okay, that's pretty devastating when it comes to getting to work, having your employees come to work, or actually getting to work if you work somewhere and you need the bus. So pretty significant. So that's the situation, that crisis condition, which is really the product of decades of neglect. That's the condition in which this legislation on shared revenue has been debated over the last few months. And the question we got to ask ourselves is, especially when big numbers get thrown around, historic 30-year investments and things like that, which all sounds good. The question is, do the policy solutions hit the target? Meaning, do they actually close the gap that exists? And the answer to that question I'm going to give you tonight is that not all of them do. And more than that, what is on the table, or what is on the table in this legislation, is not just restoring the money. It's also major changes to whether or not local governments control not just their own financial destiny, but their ability to determine the policies that are going to govern themselves. So I want to just give you a few examples of this. So this is just the size of different shared revenue packages in millions of dollars. The blue is what the governor initially proposed. The red is what Republicans initially proposed. And the orange is what passed the state assembly and is sort of now the baseline for the debate in the Senate. So all of those look like pretty big numbers. The governor's is a little over 500 million. Republicans' plans are about half that. But it's important to keep those big numbers in context. And the target that I want to talk about here is the difference between the inflation-adjusted value the local governments got in 2000 and what they would get in 2022 if that program had been adjusted to inflation, which is in the neighborhood of about $890 million. So the governor's proposal comes fairly close to that. Republicans' proposals are about a fourth of that. So again, it all sounds like big numbers, but it's important to keep in context what essentially our local governments do. And I think in both cases, it falls quite short of that. The other thing to keep in mind is the exactly what is in these bills. So in the Evers initial proposal, it wasn't just shared revenue. Most Wisconsin communities also got a sales tax option. That doesn't exist in the current compromise bill. A little over half of Evers' initial proposal, the new revenue, was for general purposes. In other words, the traditional arrangement. The state preempts local governments from collecting certain kinds of revenue, shares it back and says, you determine in your wisdom what you need to spend money on. About half of Evers' proposal was general purpose revenue local governments could determine. In the current compromise bill, there is $0 for general purpose revenue. It is 100% restricted to a few categories of expenditure: public safety, I think fire safety, EMS. Along with that, there are maintenance of effort requirements, meaning that local governments are going to be required to spend the same amount or no less than they spent in the prior year on police and fire, which really prevents local governments from gaining efficiencies in those areas and reallocating. So it kind of ties their hands in that way. And the other thing I'll just note is that the bill also, the current compromise legislation, includes a bunch of other preemptions of local authority, restriction, for example, on public health officials' ability to do things like quarantine, put quarantine restrictions into place in the case of epidemic or a pandemic, a restriction on non-binding referenda by local governments, and a variety of other preemptions, which are not necessarily about local shared revenue as such. Okay, so the other question we got to ask is, where does the money go? And how does that look under the different proposals? One thing that's interesting is that this is just looking at the average increase in aid across counties of different population sizes. And one thing that's interesting is basically 90% of counties, I think all but 6 counties would get a much bigger bump under the Evers proposal than they do under the most recent GOP proposals, which are the gray and white bars here. With municipalities, the only municipalities that do better under the GOP plans are the smallest ones in the state, those with fewer than 5,000 people. So in general, municipalities that account for about 72.5% of Wisconsin's population, all of those municipalities do better under the Evers plan, just to give you a sense of where the money is going. And then there is a special section of the legislation that deals only with Milwaukee and Milwaukee County, specifically with respect to the availability of the sales tax. So in Evers' initial proposal, the county would get 1%, and it has to share half of that with the city. In the current compromise bill, the county gets a 0.4% option for a sales tax. The city gets up to an option for 2%. The other really big change that's been salient is how that happens. In Evers' initial proposal and Republicans' initial proposal, the idea was that that sales tax issue would go to a public referendum, but there's a certain amount of urgency. A public referendum would take time. We're working on a very tight fiscal clock for budgeting for the next year. And so in the current compromise bill, all that it would take to do a sales tax would be a 2/3 vote of the county board or the common council. Some other important differences on kind of what the money can be used for. In the compromise bill, it's mostly only for accrued liabilities and public safety, as opposed to a general sales tax, which kind of, in a way, it solves the immediate policy problem, but it doesn't necessarily create a general source of revenue, I think, long term. The other important thing, and this is going to be pretty significant, I think, in the debate we see on the floor tomorrow, the Senate, is the additional strings. So Eber's initial proposal, which was sort of a plain vanilla sales tax option. In the current compromise bill, I want to just give you an example of the strings that are attached specifically to Milwaukee City and County. So there's a cap on cultural and entertainment expenditures and expenditures on nonprofit partnerships, which is a really big category. I think that those are capped at 5% total for both city and county. Now, when city and county want to do new program spending, they can't just do it by a simple majority. They were going to require a supermajority, which, if you're familiar with how county board works, especially, that's going to impede decision-making. It's going to make decision-making a little bit harder, I think possibly a lot harder. There's a blanket prohibition on any diversity, equity, and inclusion hires in city and county. There is a prohibition on the use of any tax levies on the streetcar in Milwaukee. There is a requirement that law enforcement, the fire department staffing be maintained at current levels. And pretty significantly, when it comes to the administration of justice, it transfers all of the fire and police commission's authority in Milwaukee to the Milwaukee police chief. So it basically removes that civilian oversight of the police department. Now, I'm not barred in the state of Wisconsin, not a lawyer. So take this, with a giant grain of salt, perhaps. My reading of it is that it at least sets up the provisions that apply to the city, not the county, but the city. It sets up the possibility for litigation because those provisions actually might be a violation of Article 9, Section 3 of the Wisconsin Constitution, which is the home rule amendment. County doesn't get as much protection there, but the city does. And I can talk more about why I think that isn't in Q&A. So where do things stand now? There's a tentative deal between Evers and the GOP. It looks like there are floor votes coming tomorrow. The thing I want to emphasize, the full text of what that deal includes, the distribution formula and so on, has not yet been released. We do not know the final amounts, which is why I didn't put them up there. We do know the Milwaukee sales tax will no longer require a referendum. We don't necessarily know what the new formula looks like in detail. There hasn't been a legislative fiscal bureau report, things like that. So there's a little bit of flying blind, I think, to some extent tomorrow. The other thing to note is that the agreement between Evers and the GOP does not apply to this bill alone. There's a sort of package deal that includes another piece of legislation, which was only introduced on June 9th, which includes a bill on school funding, which includes probably the largest increase of funding to vouchers and independent charters schools in about 30 years, which is, I think, fairly controversial in terms of how that money goes out there. And I can talk a little bit more about that in Q&A, although that's very late breaking. And the other thing I noticed, I think that it's possible that the strings that apply to the city of Milwaukee only could be challenged in court as violations of the municipal home rule amendment. The bottom line here, though, is as of right now, while this is probably going to be voted on tomorrow, there are still a lot of unanswered questions about the final contents and the effects of legislation that I think are going to be important to consider. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about that. So thanks. Stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. We have one question. Not sure if you can answer it. Wisconsin GOP is doing its best to bankrupt Milwaukee. I do not understand that. How will the state of Wisconsin benefit if Milwaukee goes under?
Yeah, I don't really understand the logic there. I'm not exactly sure who benefits or who makes money from that, except people in the municipal debt industry, perhaps. But to put it in context, right? 15% of the state of Wisconsin's sales tax revenues come from Milwaukee County. 15%. 25% of I think the tourism dollars in the state of Wisconsin come from Milwaukee, which is, no knock to Door County, Pastor, but it's tourism is a huge part of our economy, and counties like Door and Milwaukee are a really important part of it. And, that is really a significant kind of consideration. So, yeah, hard to understand the kind of logic of sticking it to Milwaukee beyond political theater, I think, to some extent, which has a long history, by the way.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, just as a reminder, please put your questions in the chat. That's the easiest way for us to handle them at these calls. What are the political prospects for blocking or revising this legislation?
Yeah, I try to avoid prognostication on this. It seems to be that there is some energy behind this legislation. I think the question is, does the final deal look like what Evers agreed to, right? We have a kind of agreement without legislative text at this point. It's possible that Evers could, if it doesn't look sort of like he expected it would, could veto it, have a special session. But I think there's one thing that's sort of driving the bus here, which is this impending fiscal cliff in Milwaukee. That's the thing that's kind of, which, nobody evidently wants to happen. But I think that's sort of been strategically leveraged as a way of speeding up the clock on negotiations. So I think it's possible that things could be slowed down. There's a lot of things in this legislation that just people have not thought a lot about. So, hard for me to say at this point. It looks like at least the Senate is going to take a vote on it tomorrow. What the outcome of that vote is going to be is not entirely clear. And what Evers does with respect to the veto is I think might depend on what the contents of the legislation what is sort of in the bill for real.
Thanks. Not quite sure I understand this question. Did the GOP get what they wanted with vouchers spread throughout the state?
I think if I understand the spirit of the question, I do think that the expanding voucher schools has sort of been a GOP kind of agenda item for a long time. It was not, perhaps unsurprisingly, that was not contemplated in Evers' budget at all. In fact, I think in the original budget proposal, there was a provision that would have frozen enrollment in vouchers. But that is, evidently that is the concession that's been extracted. Of course, it's also not clear. I think it's at least clear enough that there will be two different pieces of legislation. So it's possible that Evers could sign one, the share of revenue, and veto the other. So they're going to come up separately tomorrow, and then he'll have 6 days to decide whether or not to sign or to veto. So it's entirely possible that he could decide to sign one and veto the other. In which case, I think it would go back to probably they would begin debating that stuff in the context of the budget itself, in which case his veto pen gets a lot more powerful because he has a line item veto in the budget.
This kind of follows up on that. Is it true that the school funding bill would provide $3,000 per student for voucher schools and $300 per student for public schools?
I don't. So I I will not claim to know those final figures. I can try to get them to you. I literally, the Legislative Fiscal Bureau paper on the formula came out today. And I'm not even sure that that paper covers the most recent changes to the legislation, which I know is really frustrating. It's really frustrating for me to try to follow this. But I don't exactly know what the final numbers are on that, but I can try to send word back to Peter if it's helpful.
Okay, great. Yep. And I will pass it along in the follow-up email. Thank you. Does the prohibition on funding DEI positions in the proposal just apply to shared revenue funds or to overall local funds?
It applies to all local funds.
This is kind of a procedural question. How much time is required under open meetings law for publishing the text of a bill?
There is a very loose, I think, regulation on that, but just to give you an example of how loose, there was an amendment on the floor when the assembly passed the legislation. The members of the assembly had about an hour to look at it. It had 90 some changes from the bill that they had received. They got to the floor. They had about an hour to look at these 90 some changes, and then they vote. So there's not strict layover time requirements in that sense.
Okay. We're getting a lot of additional questions and number of comments. I'm wondering if maybe we should switch to our other speaker to make sure that we've got adequate time.
By the way, if you have any other questions you want me to answer, please just email me. Peter can send you my email. I'm happy to answer them.
Okay, I will do that. And, if we want to go on a little longer at the end for people to answer questions, I think that would be fine. And people that need to drop off can. So I will turn it over to Lisa to introduce our next speaker.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Peter. And thank you, Phil, for that wonderful explanation on shared revenue, just giving the history and everything like that. One of the things when we talked about this particular topic, we realized that we didn't know much about it, many of us, including myself. But then we also wanted to say that, okay, so we don't know much about it. So Phil gave us a lot of the history and kind of the details of it. But then how do we even talk about it? And how do we talk about the language that we use for people who don't know about shared revenue, and how should we just, when we want to talk about it, so that when we're trying to do our work and our advocacy, our movement work around shared revenue. And so that was one of the reasons why we wanted to have our next speaker with us. Dr. Cass Bowers is the executive director at All in Wisconsin, and is very respected in her leadership regarding communications. She's worked at the ACLU. She's been a trainer regarding relational voting in 2020, and she has been leading All in Wisconsin on communications and narrative work since early 22, and has also been working to create a hub of BIPOC, so Black, Indigenous, people of color, group of communicators for our great state of Wisconsin. And so I will pass it on to Dr. Cass Bowers, who will tell us about how should we be talking about this. I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Bowers.
Thank you so much, Lisa. I really appreciate you all having me here. Hopefully you can hear me and see my screen. Yes, okay, I got a thumbs up from David. Professor Phil did such a great job. I learned so much. I took a bunch of notes. Being fellow scholars, I always take notes and I love good research. So thank you so much. It's almost like we should go on a road show together. You give the data, I give the narrative, and we just like, go across the whole state. We'll talk about that later. So I am Dr. Cass Bowers, as Lisa said. We run this organization called All in Wisconsin. And what we do, like our goals at All in Wisconsin is to build a narrative for our movement, center communities, disrupt dog whistles, and win racial justice for freedom to thrive for all of Wisconsin. And we focus on BIPOC communities. So that's just a little bit of what we do at All in Wisconsin. So I'm gonna go a little bit quickly because I want to get back to the questions, because some of those questions were so juicy. I want to get back to them. So if I'm going too fast, please tell me to slow down. But we want to start with a shared narrative. And kind of defining some of the things we talk about. So a narrative is really how you tell the story. The story of shared revenue is another attack on Milwaukee. Professor Phil already outlined that for us very beautifully. But we have that story, we can impact how things are going to move with how we tell the story about the realities, about the facts that we were given. But then there's dog whistles, right? We know that when someone says Milwaukee, they're mostly saying Black and brown folks. The Milwaukee, where the most largest population of Black and brown folks live. So that's a coded racial undertones of language that they use. And we've already seen that. We saw that they have special exceptions for the city of Milwaukee that they don't for any other city in the state. Why is it's a coded dog whistle. It's coded language, it's a dog whistle. So we talk about that. So let's get into not the shared revenue facts that you were just given, but how we message about that. We don't message with the facts. We get the facts, we learn the facts, and we know how to pull them out of our back pocket to use, but we don't use that in narratives. We don't use that in our writing or in our social media. I don't know, some of you may be as old as I am and remember just the facts, ma'am, and how he would come in and say, just the facts, I only want the facts. Well, we want to do the opposite when it comes to shared revenue and messaging about shared revenue. Yes, we want to get the facts. Yes, we want to get the data and all the research. But when it comes to writing, we want to lead with our shared values because we know they're lying. We know that they aren't really looking out for Milwaukee or other cities in the state. We know that if Milwaukee goes bankrupt, it will hurt the whole rest of the state. Why are they lying about it? It's coded. So we want to call that out. We want to call out the lie. We want to say that we want to ensure that we can ride the bus to get to work and go to a library and go to the park, go to a public school in our neighborhood. We want to say that and come together because that's what we all want across the state. So we want to have the facts, but in our back pocket. So remember, our job is to point out what they are trying to do. Why are they trying to do it? And remind people of what Milwaukee and the rest of Wisconsin actually want to see from legislators. We want to see them fund our libraries, fund our parks, have clean, smooth roads, have clean water, clean tap water for our kids to drink. All of those things, right? We want to remember to start with what we want. We want better than this shared revenue plan. This fake shared revenue plan is what I call it. And so we have some messaging. So we can just get into the messaging right away and go through how we've messaged around this. So we have messaging guides. We've worked with LIT, Leaders Igniting Transformation, Block, Black Leaders Organizing for Communities, and ART, the African American Roundtable, are the three groups we've been working with a lot in close proximity with to get some of these messagings out. And they all have action items for the shared revenue plan. But again, like Professor Phil said, we don't know. We don't know what we don't know. They are still discussing it, debating it, and it's moving all around. It keeps coming back and it's changed. Everything keeps changing. But we do know what we want. We do know that we have a shared value. We do know that we can imagine our neighborhoods having everything that they need. Like if we really just stop and think right now, if we had everything we needed in our neighborhoods, we wouldn't have to talk about shared revenue the way we do, because we would have funding for our libraries and our parks and our public schools, which are all the things that they're like kind of taking off the table. They're saying, you don't need that many libraries. You don't need public schools in your neighborhoods. Parks don't need flowers. I don't know if you all knew, but in Milwaukee, they are not putting flowers in parks this year because they don't have the money to fund that. So we can fund our neighborhoods so that everyone has the resources to make our schools, hospital, parks, and programs all that our families deserve. That's the messaging. That's one messaging that we can all kind of get behind, right? But we have more. Together, we can demand our lawmakers at all levels redirect our funds back to where we want them to be. So nothing stands in the way of us providing a great life for our families. Nothing, like not a shared revenue plan that takes away from the city of Milwaukee or any city in Wisconsin, but gives it back to the people. And again, I'm gonna quote Professor Phil in every messaging I do on this, because this is our money, right? We gave it. This is not them giving us a gift, as he said. We're getting back the money we put in. And it's our money, and we need to make sure that lawmakers know that. So that's where we want to start with messaging, shared values. So again, instead of doing their duty to provide affordable services to struggling Wisconsinites, a handful of politicians are wasting taxpayer dollars on shared revenue plans that continue to harm us. Wisconsin cities and towns don't need more cops. They need clean water. They need great schools. They need local hospitals. And we could keep going, right? That list could keep going. They need libraries. They need better streets. They need, like, there's so many things that our cities across Wisconsin need, but it's none of the things that they put in the shared revenue plan. So that's another message. And I just want to kind of reset us a little bit. Some of you have already seen this, but I want to kind of reset how the autonomy, is what we call it, of a winning narrative works. We always start with the shared value that names race and class. Then we name the villain. The villain here is pretty easy. Our villains are pretty easy nowadays, or at least in Wisconsin right now. Names the who, what, how, and why of the violation. Value, names the racial scapegoating as a weapon that harms all of us. Attacking Milwaukee will harm the entire state. And like someone asked in the chat, what will happen if Milwaukee goes bankrupt? Why would they want to do that? How will that hurt the rest of the state? We're not talking about that as much as we should be. We should be coming together for Milwaukee, not just because of what Milwaukee puts in, but because we come together as Wisconsinites. So that's what we put in our narratives. And then we demand unity. We come together to frame a demand in unity. We're going to come together to do this. We're not going to keep pointing the finger at Milwaukee or any other city. We're going to come together and uplift our shared value, and then make a strong call to action. Our strong call to action, at least for shared revenue, is that it's not truly a shared revenue plan. It's not giving us what we deserve, or it's not giving us back what we put into the revenue in Wisconsin. So our call to action is to call your legislators, to post on social media, to do all the things to make sure that your base, your congregation, your members are motivated and can see what they can do to impact shared revenue. We have lots and lots of messaging. We have so many paragraphs and tweets and all of these things, and I did not want to put that in a PowerPoint presentation, but I did want to just have one quick one that I can read, and we can kind of think through of how we can make it better, how we can change it, how you can customize it for yourself. So no matter where you live in Wisconsin, our families should have everything they need to thrive. Good, clean water, local public schools, neighborhood hospitals, and great paying jobs. But a greedy few are trying to redirect resources from our communities to their corporate donors, police backers, and the wealthiest in our state. They stir division based on where we live, hoping we will blame Milwaukee for the hardships these wealthy few create, so we don't join together to demand our shared resources, deliver the programs, schools, and support all of our families need. But together, we demand our lawmakers fund our neighborhoods, not the police. Nothing stands in the way of us providing a great life for our families. And I want to put a caveat out there, like, this is just one sample messaging. When we say together we demand our lawmakers fund our neighborhoods, not, you can put anything in the not take away our libraries, not take away bus routes in Milwaukee, not whatever the not is. So this is just one example of a messaging that you can use. And it's in our guide. I just wanted to draw it out for you. But what I like to say, and I am a PK, so I say I use a lot of church analogies, but I say we're building our choir. We want to sing a song of joy and happiness and thriving, and also come together to empower each other, to win for our communities, and for our choir to sing louder than the opposition. So if our words don't spread, they don't work. So we want to keep saying the same things, reading out of the same hymnal, so that we can spread our words, to engage, excite, and motivate our base, our members, our congregation, our leaders. So we need to ensure that our words matter to the folks that are reading them, and that they're impactful, and that it comes from our shared value and our shared narratives of how we can always come together. And the things that we want are so similar, and that's what we want to communicate and build out our choir. So I went quick, and I just had a couple of slides, but questions, what questions do you have? And I'm gonna stop the share and go back to the larger group. Oops. I gotta stop the share. The share wouldn't stop. Questions. If we want to go back to Professor Phil, I would love that too.
Well, thank you so much, Cass. I had a question, maybe on behalf of the group. Is there a link to this messaging kit that we could share with our group?
There are, I'm gonna drop them all. There's so many links. Let's start with this one. And another thing I want to say is that it's changing so much that this document that I'm putting in here is a moving document. Like, we are updating it in real time. So come back to it, because as soon as we learn more, we put more words in there for you all to be able to use. So it's growing, it's getting longer and longer. That's the one. That's our narrative guide. But then we also have a newsletter that we call Don't Take the Bait. And we also have more information on this as well there. And I'll drop that in the chat as well. And then one last thing is my email address. If you would like, to get more into the weeds and detailed on race class narrative, how to create narratives and be more customized for what you need it for, I am willing and able to come and do that for all of you or any one of you.
Great, thanks. I'm just kind of looking over, there aren't any new specific questions, but there have been a lot of questions about communicating in the chat. And for example, one says, my state senator and rep are Larson and Clancy. Contacting them is preaching to the choir. Is it even worth contacting GOP legislators, or will they just ignore comments from folks not in their district? I mean, I think I can answer that last question. They generally don't listen to people not in their district, but is it worth preaching to the choir? Is it worth preaching to those that you know aren't listening?
I would say it's always worth preaching to the choir. Every now and then you got to turn around and let them know that they need to do something. If I know certain legislators, they feel more empowered when their community is standing behind them to say, nope, this isn't what we want. So the more people that contact Chris Larson, yes, we know that he is on our side, but the more people that contact him to say, this is not what we need, it will help, because he can use that. The GOP, I don't know. Maybe I don't know about the GOP.
Yep. Okay. Let's see what else. Kind of communicating particular ideas. How do we let people know that we have lots of money? They keep saying that we don't, and we do. So is there a way we can address that?
Yeah, I would just say it. Like, definitely say, you can use like some of the information that Professor Phil gave you and say there's money here. They get, I wrote it down, they get 15% of revenue from us in sales tax and 25% from tourism. Where is that money? Like, you can ask them, you can ask the GOP and ask them those questions. But when you're creating narratives and things that you want to post socially, we definitely want to start with a shared value and say, you know, we want our money back. This is our money. We deserve this money. And then what we want to use it for. We're not saying we want to use it to, you know, do something frivolous. We want it for the services that we need and we deserve, like libraries and bus routes and schools and clean water. And like the list can go on and on.
Right, thanks. Yeah, I mean, and one comment, GOP mostly only wants to fund police and safety. To me, that only hurts the poor and vulnerable. How do we advocate to help legislators understand that spending money to get people educated and get transportation to jobs will help keep our community safer?
Yeah, this is such a great question. It goes back to the chart. Like, I really want to go on the road with Professor Phil. Keep going back to that chart where it shows you the pie of where the money goes. Like, our money goes into one department, and what happens to all the rest of the departments. So really painting that picture of how the funding that we get, we're defunding every other department. So we really need to be clear on where we want the money to go. Yes, there's a surplus, and yes, we need it in Milwaukee, and we need it for social services. We need it for mental health services. We need it for all the things that if our communities were funded to like the highest level, we wouldn't have all the other issues. And so we really have to be good at get good at communicating that. Like, if we were fully funded, we wouldn't need more police, and we don't need them now. We just need that funding to go to services that really do help us. They only want to fund the police. Go ahead.
Oh, well, this was another one. I mean, not talking to legislators so much, but how about talking with all our friends and relatives in other areas of the state with the facts and figures to show how much of the state surplus was gotten from Milwaukee and not returned?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. I agree with that. Start with the facts and then move into the things that we can all bring, like that we all need our shared value of what we want to see. So yes, I mean, we have all the facts now. So when you're talking to your friends and family, tell them, this is what the budget looks like, and this is what we need, and it's there. We do have it.
And then this is just a comment. Maybe you can elaborate on it. It's good to have local examples of what the stinginess of shared revenue funding has meant. In Outagamie County, it has meant this county nursing home has only 3 of 5 units running due to staffing issues. City of Appleton, it means the replacement of water mains is an extended schedule, and we waste money on lots of repairs that should be replacement.
Love that. I love all the local examples because I live in Milwaukee. I have Milwaukee examples, but if you all can send me your examples, I'll put it in the guide and show that it's not just a Milwaukee issue. Yes, it's like hyper focus on Milwaukee, but it affects all of Wisconsin. So definitely love local examples. There's a ton of them. I just don't know of them all. Like, one person's not going to know them all, but I would love to hear more.
If folks are looking for examples, by the way, every year or every 2 years, your local governments or municipal or county government will have a budget process, and the departments usually will provide some sort of testimony or a PowerPoint on like, here's how we're stitching everything together with chicken wire and gum. I mean, I think the reason why we don't see the effects sometimes is that people are like too good at trying to make things work with no resources. Like they're working themselves, to exhaustion. But they do communicate about what it means to not have enough staff. And so that information is out there. If you go to your local government's website, and it's kind of confusing because the websites are often like poorly designed. If you go back and look at the budget process for the last year, you will find testimony about what it means to not have that Outagamie County example is a good one too. Yeah,
Absolutely. So good. Thank
Yeah, if you can keep doing more with less, eventually you can do everything with nothing. Let's see, there may be some more some of the policy related questions. Let's see if I can back up and find some of them. Could the prohibition of local advisory referenda violate the Wisconsin Constitution?
That's not for me.
Sorry, what was the question?
Sorry?
What was the question? Yes, if you would.
Yeah, if the prohibition of local advisory referenda, could that violate the Wisconsin Constitution?
That's a good question. I think it's something to investigate, litigating on. The thing is, the home rule part of the Constitution basically says, and has been interpreted to mean that like the state can, invade local government's authority, but it has to do so for reasons that actually relate to the entire policies that affect the entire state, right? Now, over the years, that power has been chipped away at in the courts. But the example I provided about Milwaukee being kind of a bright line rule is like one thing the courts have said is that you can't like single out a government for treatment and say like, we're going to do this and it applies only to you. We're going to like prohibit you in ways that apply only to you. That's a statewide ban on non-binding referenda. It might have an easier time under the current precedents of getting, legislature might have an easier time getting away with it. It doesn't mean that there isn't a case to be investigated and to go back and actually evaluate, because the court's precedents and these things, they're very fluid. I mean, it's policy all the way down, and they're sort of reinventing it. And if you look back at the Wisconsin Constitution, the idea of the courts in Wisconsin was they were supposed to be democratically accountable. That's why we vote for judges and things, like that was the idea. And so it's the law is supposed to be a little bit more fluid. So, I mean, it's hard to say, it might be a harder case to make before, 7 judges, but there might be a case there. Again, not a lawyer. I don't even play one on TV.
Right. Yeah, I don't see any more outstanding questions, and we are kind of getting to 7:30. So maybe we could wrap it up, and I can provide email addresses for Cass and for Phil for people to follow up with questions, anything that they thought of later or that I missed here. Let's see. So I guess Bonnie, is it up to me to give the call to action and thank our speakers?
Yes, it's up to you. And then Reverend Briscoe is going to give our closing prayer tonight.
Okay. All right. Well, I don't know. You don't usually give a round of applause to speakers on Zoom. I mean, you've got the little hands you can put up and that sort of thing. But I really want to thank both our speakers for giving such great information, not only about the facts, but also the values that we need to combine with the facts to get our message across. I will, as I say, we'll be sending a follow-up email. It'll have links. It'll have, the link to the recording. It'll have the email addresses. It'll have the other links that have been provided. I'm saving the chat, so I hope I shall have captured all of those. But for our call to action, we are, those of us that are kind of the leadership team of this, we're starting to think again about the Teach the Truth week of events in October. And we just kind of want to put a bug in people's ear to start thinking about what you can do in your community, in your locality, to lift up some of the history that either we haven't been taught or that is people are actively trying to suppress, about the darker, more unpleasant and unjust side of American history, the history of Wisconsin, but also stories of resilience, stories of things that, ways that communities that have been under pressure, that have been under oppression, have survived and fought back, and ways that people have joined hands to work together, and the contributions that communities that have kind of been shunted to the side have still made to our community as a whole. One thing that's kind of a similar thing that we've done in the past years. This year, we're also inviting people to think about holidays. There are many national holidays that we celebrate without thinking about their history, and we aren't thinking about sort of the shadow side of those histories, those national holidays, things like Thanksgiving, Columbus Day, which we're now thinking about as Indigenous Peoples Day. You know, what is the actual history behind those, and what does that illuminate about who we are and what we want to become? And also to think about what are some of things in our history that we could celebrate that we don't. How could we create some new holidays that would lift up some of the positive aspects of the struggle for true freedom and true justice in our country? So we'll be putting out some materials, publicity materials, resource materials for that. And we'll be sharing that with everyone. So start thinking about that and be looking for that information. And we'll turn it over to Pastor Briscoe.
Amen. Thanks for that information, guys. That was very helpful and very inspiring. It makes us all want to go out and do more and inform the people that we represent that beware of what's coming and do not be dismayed. So with that, could you bow your heads as we go into prayer? Oh God, our Father, we ask that you invoke your richest blessings on every member that's online tonight, every organization that's represented tonight, and every organization around this country, around the world, that's looking out for social justice and the least of those. We ask that your blessings be guaranteed and fulfilling, so that we do not get weary in well-doing, but we will all fight until the end to inform, educate our people, because we know the people perish for the lack of vision. And vision is given sometimes through knowledge and the wisdom that you give from above. So we ask that you bestow all of that wisdom on us, so that we will let people not give up, not give in, but continue to fight the good fight, to bring this information to the people, to stand on your word, to stand in your army, and to show up. Because we know when we show up, you show out. We do not have to fight the battles, but we do have to warn the people that from the hills come the danger. And from those that rule over us and rule in greed and rule in self-perpetuity, we know that you have set us up with your Holy Spirit in order to be a people guided by your faith, guided by your direction, and empowered to fight the good fight. These things we ask and count them all done in your darling son Jesus' name. Amen.